If you hack the Vatican server, have you tampered in God's domain? Aaron Alston. The Vatican is one of the smallest and largest nations at the same time. Bizarre, right? From government to politics to society, it blurs the lines between what we consider a geopolitical power, or even a nation state. Given that so much of the discussion about the Vatican is deeply controversial for various reasons, I'm going to try my best to be as objective as possible and discuss the geopolitics of the Vatican impartially. I want to keep in mind that this is not a video about religion, because after all, this is not Reddit circa 2009. This is a video about power. So let's start off. The Holy See is the smallest nation on the planet by land size, and by population, even smaller than virtually every Pacific Island nation. It also lacks its own military, as 80-year-olds are not particularly good at fighting. No baby is born a citizen of this nation, and speaking of babies, the nation doesn't really have any female population either. In fact, it doesn't really have any native population. It lacks any real border security unless you count the walls, but then again, it's not as though the Italian military is going to invade Vatican City anytime soon. The southeast of the nation contains St. Peter's Basilica, as well as St. Peter's Square. It also holds numerous palaces. This is the most important center of the Vatican. Aside from St. Peter's Basilica lays a number of gardens, along with civic administration buildings. To the north lies various tourist amenities like gift shops as well as a Vatican Museum. Really the only form of economy the place has. The Vatican, after all, is one of only two other micronations situated completely within another country's territory. One of the others is San Marino, also in Italy. Due to the Vatican's small size and its lack of strategic depth, it's pretty much a death sentence for the country if it ever genuinely got invaded for the sake of conquest. However, this is extremely unlikely. Under your typical geopolitical circumstances, this would be a nightmare, but this is no typical geopolitical circumstance. So how did this circumstance start? Well, St. Peter, Jesus' apostle and best friend, became the first pope, and set up the foundations of the institution we now know as the Catholic Church. However, it was St. Paul who played the most pivotal role in spreading Christianity, as well as solidifying many of Christianity's theological concepts. Nonetheless, I would still say that St. Peter played the most important role on an institutional level. However, he was unfortunately crucified upside down. However, Christianity grew nonetheless, and under Emperor Constantine, it was no longer illegal. Constantine also founded the city of Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, before it got taken over by the Turks. When it was first founded, it eventually rose up to be a prominent city, and eventually was the head of the Eastern Roman Empire. At this point, the Roman Empire was so large to manage that it split off. In the East, you pretty much had a consolidation of political and religious power. However, in the West, you saw the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and as a result, you saw a fracturing of various polities and religious authority, with the Catholic Church centered in Vatican managing religious affairs, whereas the various kings and their vassals managed the political affairs. However, the Pope definitely partook in many of the political affairs nonetheless. The kings and nobles could be excommunicated by the Church, thereby increasing the Pope's power and making him the head honcho in the western half of the European continent. With state power dwindling in Western Europe, the Catholic Church spearheaded many of the scientific and technological advancements of the day by preserving knowledge, oftentimes through the use of monasteries, translating much of what had been written by Greeks and later Arabs. Later issues like Galileo being under house arrest would rather be the exception rather than the norm when it came to the relationship between science and religion at this time. With the Western Roman Empire gone, the Catholic Church did play a pivotal role in helping the successor kings, namely Charlemagne, convert many Germanic populations to Christianity. Eventually, a new threat would emerge, and that was the rise of Islam. Islam had spread throughout the Middle East, and had crushed both the Eastern Romans, who were by and large Greeks, as well as the Persians. And while the Vatican did not like the Eastern Roman Empire, at least they were Christian, so the Pope declared Deus Vult on behalf of the Eastern Roman Empire to defend the Holy Land, namely Jerusalem, from the Muslim Seljuk Turks. This brought many Christians in contact with the more advanced Muslim world, and thereby did lead to some questioning Vatican authority. On top of that, while the First Crusade had some mild success, later crusades ranged from failures to mediocre gains. And on the Fourth Crusade, the Western Christians actually sacked Constantinople, weakening the Eastern Orthodox Church, and leading to the pathway for the Turks to take over the Eastern Roman Empire. A few centuries later, the Catholic Church also failed to provide substantial leadership during the Great Bubonic Plague. There were also various instances of political bickering between various popes. Sometimes you actually had 3 popes at the same time. And on top of that, there were also controversies over corruption within Vatican City. This led to the Protestant Reformation. This was spearheaded by Martin Luther, who issued a bunch of complaints to the Catholic Church. However, he was excommunicated, and along with others, he started the Protestant Reformation. They were called Protestants because they protested. Thankfully for the Catholic Church, Spain and Portugal, both vehemently Catholic nations, ended up conquering much of the Americas, and in the case of Spain, the Philippines. Both Latin America and the Philippines tend to be some of the most adamantly Catholic parts of the world, with a few exceptions. Another threat was brewing, though, the Age of Enlightenment, which proposed that faith and authority were not the main ways to discover the truth, but rather through scientific inquiry, logic, and reason. Eventually, many more would begin to question theocracy and advocate for secular governments. It's worth keeping in mind that the Italian peninsula, throughout much of this history after the collapse of the Roman Empire, was fractured, and the Catholic Church wanted to keep its own autonomy. However, the unification of Italy was at loggerheads with this. The Italians wanted to have some of the power over the Catholic Church, but at the same time they wanted to respect the soft power and the faith behind the Catholic Church. The Vatican would later have to adopt to much of secular laws. However, it would be under the protection of Italy, while receiving some autonomy under Mussolini. Speaking of Mussolini, the Catholic Church stayed neutral during World War II. The Vatican was not particularly sympathetic to the fascist powers of Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, and it never went full-blown fascist, and it did try to help the Jews and other oppressed peoples, such as the mentally disabled. But, on the other hand, it couldn't really stand up to the fascists to any significant degree, given the fact that it was surrounded by Mussolini's Italy. The United States in particular viewed this as insufficiently anti-fascist. Nonetheless, the two nations, if you could call Vatican a nation, would eventually become quasi-allies during the Cold War era, as many in the Catholic Church saw the enemy as being communism, as it was atheistic. During the 1960s, however, there were vast social changes, and the Catholic Church had to adapt to this through the Second Vatican Council. The Church had to adapt to modernity to some degree while still maintaining its core ethos. It loosened some of the more reactionary measures when it came to issues like religious freedom and women's rights. Nonetheless, it still stayed strongly conservative on social issues while being more economically left-leaning, as they viewed support for the poor as a noble cause. Eventually, you got Pope John Paul II. He was from Poland, and Poland was a communist country at the time. He was fervently anti-communist, and worked with the capitalist West to quash down communist oppression. After he was gone, he was replaced by Pope Benedict, who was a very conservative pope, pretty doctrinaire on social issues, who eventually resigned, being the first pope to resign from his post in hundreds of years. Then came Pope Francis, who has been known for being particularly media-savvy and fairly socially liberal by the standards of the Vatican. Pope Francis has been quite successful in walking a tightrope between maintaining the traditions of Catholicism while at the same time dealing with modernity. Now let's switch to the modern demographic society and governance. On one hand, the Catholic Church is very small, if you count it as only being Vatican City, only around 600 people. and it has no female citizens and no native-born citizens, and no children for that matter. But if you count the flock of the people who count themselves as Catholic around the world, then the population of the Vatican is 1 billion, making it one of the top 3 countries in the world by population. The Vatican, on the other hand, doesn't really have its own military. As you know, the average age of the place is probably like 75. However, it does have guardsmen, mainly the Swiss Guard. The Swiss Guard's orange and purple pantaloons probably make for bleak camouflage prospects, but it doesn't really matter because today the Italian military protects the Vatican. The Vatican is also one of the most hierarchical institutions in the world. After all, there's the Pope on top, and he has been deemed to be infallible since the 19th century, issuing decrees from his throne. The Pope is both a religious figure and a political figure, controlling matters on earth as the king of the Vatican, but he also manages his connection between the heaven and the earth. The legal jurisdiction of which he reigns over is called the Holy See, and he is also the Archdiocese of Rome, which in turn is the head honcho of the entire Catholic Church. So he pretty much has multiple titles in one. While most Catholics are quote-unquote Roman Catholics, there are numerous Catholics or Catholic churches that fall under the Eastern Catholic tradition, but are in still full correspondence with the Pope, rather than Orthodox churches. Some of these Eastern Catholic churches maintain some quasi-autonomy with some special rituals and customs that are in place relevant to those specific cultures. The most notable are the Maronite Catholics in Lebanon and the Armenian Catholic Church. At the end of the day, all roads lead to Rome. And under the Pope, there are cardinals, and under them are archdioceses, who basically run the local chapters of the Catholic Church, regardless of whether you are in Manila or in some small county in Alabama. Under those are subgroups like priests and then deacons, and then the whole flock. As you can see, it's quite hierarchical with multiple steps. This system tends to value education and merit, which can be great, but can also be very rigid and hierarchical, and inflexible to changes in the modern world. It also tends to be a rather insular affair. Nonetheless, the Vatican does use some external forces such as healthcare and educational institutions as part of its power structure. There's also a diplomatic aspect to the Vatican, as it manages its own foreign affairs. If you've ever been there, you've seen plenty of embassies. Overall, the Vatican gets along with the vast majority of countries around the world, with a few exceptions like China. Overall, its closest ally would be Italy, as Italy provides defense for it, and takes care of utilities and just about everything else. The Vatican is not a member of the European Union, as it's not a democracy, or a really functioning state at all. It's not a member of NATO, as it doesn't even have a military, and it's not even a member of the United Nations, it's just an observer state. However, it has played an important role in foreign policy, such as opposing communism during the Cold War, opposing the Iraq War, helping the poor to a degree, and opposing birth control around the world. Whether or not you agree with these issues is another matter, but they have played a pivotal role in geopolitics. They've also mediated conflicts between the US and Cuba. But on the other hand, they've also had to have their own relations mediated by others, namely that with the People's Republic of China. Due to the heavy-handed force of the Chinese Communist Party that has historically been atheistic, the Vatican has had issues, namely with the Chinese Communist Party not allowing the Catholic Church to have full control over the priests and dioceses in the country. The Chinese Communist Party wants the power to veto any sort of priest or any sort of clergy member who is not sufficiently pro-CCP. If you think its foreign relations are weird, wait till you look at its economy. Now, as stated before, it's not part of the EU, yet it has its own bank with its own euros. Funny enough, its coins are collector's items, rather than a currency. And while it makes a lot of revenue from museum ticket sales and souvenir purchases, a lot of that money ends up getting spent on the restoration of art. To be fair, it does get a lot of money from donations by Catholics all around the world. However, again, it also runs a bunch of institutions that are quite expensive to maintain. There have also been controversies over corruption and a lack of transparency in these institutions. The Catholic Church runs a very large array of gold reserves and real estate dealings all around the world. The Catholic Church also faces numerous threats, around the world, not only due to some of these controversies, but mainly over the rise of secularism, particularly in mainland Western Europe. Church attendance has been in a staggering state of decline in much of Europe, and to a lesser extent the United States. Less and less Europeans are claiming that faith plays an important role in their lives. However, there are some, like Poland, that still tend to be fairly religious. With the collapse of communism, as well as the new atheist movement, it's not so much hostility towards Catholicism that is an issue, but rather apathy towards it. Hot button issues like sex ed, gay rights, trans rights, reproductive rights, etc., have really put a damper on the Catholic Church, particularly in the Western world, among younger populations. One of the most prominent examples of this is in Ireland, where a predominantly Catholic country has become far more secular over the course of a generation. Other examples of this include Quebec and Canada, also a traditionally conservative Catholic part of the country that has now become more secular. This brings up key issues like tradition versus modernity, among others. But even in some places like Latin America, once a Catholic bastion, you've now seen the rise of Protestant Christianity in the form of charismatic churches. Many Latinos and Latinas find evangelical Christianity to be more dynamic than the rigid Catholic Church. Many Protestant evangelical churches have appealed to many people in the developing world and by and large have a less rigid hierarchy, are more transparent, and by and large have a more modern aesthetic with guitars and keyboards playing at sermons rather than organs, which may look like anachronisms. In many ways, the Vatican Church is far more liberal than evangelicals, though. While they lack the aesthetic and media savviness to appeal to large swaths of younger people, in comparison, they actually have some pretty open-minded perspectives when it comes to fighting poverty and climate change. But all of this pales in comparison to the child PDF file controversies, which you can look up on your own time, that have probably done the most to damage the Catholic Church's reputation as a moral beacon. Many Westerners are finding meaning and purpose in Eastern religions, New Age spirituality, various hobbies, subcultures, and political culture wars rather than that of old school Catholicism. However, keep in mind that this trend could reverse, due to lower birth rates of secular people, as well as a meaning crisis that has prevailed in many secular countries. To be fair, the Catholic Church is doing very well in other parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, as they happen to have rising birth rates there, and I wouldn't be shocked if in my lifetime there was an African pope. This might seem progressive, but it may not be. After all, a lot of Africans are very conservative on social issues, and the rising power in Africa among the Vatican Church tilt may make the Church move in a more conservative direction. Another ace in the Catholic sleeve is the immense amount of power in educational and healthcare institutions all around the world, particularly among the young people that they educate. Overall, the previous Pope Benedict failed to walk the tightrope between modernity and tradition. Pope Francis, on the other hand, has done a much better job. However, we'll have to wait and see what his successor will be like. Some have compared Pope Francis to Gorbachev, the last premier of the communist Soviet Union, who instituted reforms to soften communism and the authoritarianism of his nation, but this eventually led to the collapse of communism, and some have claimed that this too will happen to the Vatican Church. As it opens up, its walls might close. But we don't really know whether this is going to be the case. After all, the longevity of the Vatican is pretty staggering. This is an institution that has survived Germanic barbarians, the Huns, Islam, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, various European conflicts, fascism, communism, and yes, even atheist neckbeards on Reddit. All of this for a country that is roughly the same size as SeaWorld, Orlando, or Disneyland. You could probably fit the entire country in Shamu's aquarium. And that's pretty staggering. So will the Catholic Church remain a major power player, or perhaps even a bigger power player? Or will it crumble into irrelevancy as modernity kicks in? Only time will tell, but I believe it will cruise along with some bumps along the road. Thanks for watching.